trying to both get more girls and women involved in comics as creators and readers, and also trying to convince publishers that yes, women and girls actually do read comics. You should try making more comics that different kinds of people want to read.
Which was so influential, that what you did.
It had a pretty big ripple effect, but it was building directly on the legacy of everything that came before us. So, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? This is Trina Robbins.
Hi. Oh my goodness. Gee whiz. I've been working in comics. My first published comic was 1966, so you can do the math. Besides drawing comics and fighting with the Boys Club, since the middle 80s really, I have been researching the histories of women who drew comics in the early 20th century, because when guys write comics histories, they just want to write about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And so if I hadn't started writing about the women who drew the comics, nobody would know that these women existed. So that's what I did.
Trina has done an amazing string of books about female comic book characters and female comic book creators. The Great Female Superheroes, The Great Female Heroes, Pretty in Ink was one of your more recent ones.
Yes.
And lots more. American Women Cartoonists, the 3 versions?
Yes. And many more. I have 2 books coming up. Yeah, excuse me. It's not coronavirus. 2 books that will be out this summer about early 20th century women cartoonists, and they both look extremely beautiful. They both have really good art directors. So, you know, keep an eye out.
And then we also have with us Barbara Mendez, who was published in comics as Willie Mendez.
Hi, I'm Barbara Willie Mendez. I have to say off the bat how much all we artists have to owe Trina for her historical books, and Anana for the Friends of Lulu panel that opened my eyes into where I was for 40 years from comics. We'll get into that, but I know Trina, there's a trajectory. So Trina got the $1,000 from Ron Turner.
Can I back up 1 second to what led up to this? Because I want to hear a little bit about how you got into this.
This is Trina's baby, so this is I come in on it. So
I can talk about what led up to it.
Yeah.
In 1970, the underground comic scene in San Francisco was a boys' club, completely a boys' club.
Let's fast forward to that.
Yeah, that's good. Very extremely hostile to women. I don't want to keep saying bad things about Crumb, but he was the big influence, and his comments were extremely misogynistic. This is a good example, and it's a mild example. I can't show the really strong stuff in public because there might be kids here. In this comic, he's being interviewed on radio by Lark Clark, who's a real person. She was a good friend of mine. So he's writing about a real person there. And in the comic, he admits to having this hatred of women, this misogynistic feelings, and finally, in the end, he kills her. He kills my friend Lark Clark.
The first time I ever saw Crumb's work, I hated it because of the misogynistic side of it, and it took me many, many years to revisit it and be able to appreciate his illustration.
Oh, he's an incredibly good artist.
So I come from the land of To Replace That.
Right, so this was the climate of underground comics at the time.
Derek Rashayam Tovit. The people who come into my gallery under 40, they never heard of Robert Crumb.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah. So on the positive side, I'm going to continue on that.
Oh wait, no, I have to talk about joining the newspaper.
Oh, yeah.
So because I did criticize this misogyny, the boys didn't like me, because Crumb was God, you have to understand that, and criticizing him was akin to heresy. So they didn't want my stuff because, as far as they were concerned, I was a man-hating feminist bitch. Feminazi bitch, I'm sorry. So I joined a newspaper, which turns out to have been the first women's liberation newspaper in the country, and that was called It Ain't Me Babe. And I did art for them. Are you sure? Yeah, you are good. I did art for them. And finally, because I was working with them and I had their moral support, I wasn't alone anymore. I said, we can do a comic book.
And Willie, were you also involved with the newspaper at this time?
No, I was not, but I did mention in my recent TV, the documentary thing, that I just owe so much to Trina that from that era. And that she raised my consciousness. This is where it comes in, because she's working on the magazine. We're friends already. Rick and I picked Wonder on the map and moved to Oregon, and Trina inherited our apartment in the Noe Valley. So we have our new babies. We're very close friends. And we talked. Trina raised my consciousness.
Now, can you tell me, how did you both get interested in creating your own comic book stories to begin with? Because you were both cartooning by the time you did the N8 Me by Babe comic, right?
Well, for this book, I was doing a lot of fantasy. I had just gotten into the Goddess. Now everybody knows about the Goddess, but in those days it was new. Wow, there had been a Goddess, and once people worshipped a goddess and not a bearded guy in the sky. I mean, that was really new in those days. So I did what I believe is the first comic about the Goddess. I did it in It Ain't Me, Babe. You want to talk about Oma?
Well, what are we on? I thought we were on the question about what
she wanted to know how we got
so many stories, folks.
I mean, if I got that right, you wanted to know how we decided on what we would do for the book?
No, it's like, how do we get into making comics?
How you got into making comics?
Oh, comics in general. Okay. Well, I had been a big comic fan growing up. And I always drew and I always wrote. And I mean, like I would be like 10 or 11 years old. My mother was a school teacher who taught me to read at the age of 4. And she would bring, and I always drew, she would bring home reams of Board of Education 8.5 by 11 paper and lots of Board of Education pencils too, number 2 pencils. And I would take the paper and fold it in half, and I had 4 pages to do a 4-page comic. And I did them. The pencils, I would chew the erasers off first, but then I would also, they were good pencils. And so I really was always into comics. When I was 14, my mother decided, she said, well, you're in high school now, and this is kid stuff. So I was a very obedient daughter. I said, okay, Mom. And I gave my comics by thousands of dollars worth of comics to the neighborhood kids. Oh, yeah. But you can't dwell on that. That way lies depression and madness. So I wasn't reading comics until the mid-60s. I started reading again because it was the Marvel Renaissance. The superheroes, the new superheroes, Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. And I liked Doctor Strange best because he was very psychedelic. And I even tried, I realized that these little drawings I was doing were comics. And I tried doing superhero comics, but of course I'm not a superhero artist, that didn't work. And it wasn't until I saw, I was living in LA at the time, I saw a Lower East Side, New York underground newspaper called the East Village Oven. And it had comics. And but they weren't superheroes. They were comics that related to us counterculture people. And I realized, wow, you can do this. And shortly after that, I went to New York and drew what I consider my first published comic. It was a 1-page. Do you have it up there? Do you have it?
That one I don't have. No, but
that's
we can.
Okay. Drew this 1-page kind of, what would you call it? An early comic, or comic or something, because it's mostly just this cute teenage girl and her huge speech balloon. And I didn't even draw it to be published, I just drew it and gave it to them. And they published it, and that was my first published comic, 1966.
And Willie, how did you, because you have a fine art background, I know, so how did you...
So I'm coming to it from fine art, but I'll just put up, because my thing is painting. So what do these look like? They look like little paintings done with, color sets. I brought a color set to show you. So my first husband was best friends with Kim Deitch, who was also Trina's boyfriend at one time. So I came in, I'm just an artist. So like when I met Kim, he used to bring his Sunshine Girl, famous strips for Gothic Blimp Works, by our place to show us before he'd go. And so I started drawing comics just for fun, and I did learn about Marvels from Rick, from my husband. So I knew about the Marvels. And then when Kim took over Gothic Blimp Works, he invited me to do a page. So I'm big with the splash panels. It's like a painting, right? It's a painting, but it's black and white. And a lot of people will get it for cheap, see? So, and oh, if you read those panels now, it's like me today. It's the mystic, the lady, the queen, the be good, all the goody. It's so like my comic that's coming out, Queen of Cosmos Comics. If you remember one thing, it's to watch for the 88-page book launching at San Diego
We both have
Comic
stuff
Con.
coming out this summer.
That's right. I jumped ahead because, so that's how I began to do it. And then the story developed. I'm wondering, then I started to make stories because I got into it from Kim. We moved to San Francisco and I got in a few books. So I'd done a few stories. But the major one, first major, was with Trina. That stood up, just let me show it from the book. So Trina did invite me into It Ain't Me Babe to have the first story, Oma, which I named my daughter after, and the back cover. So this went over great. And then Trina and I co-edited together All Girl Thrills. So this is, and Trina again did the cover. And again, and this is priceless because I fly exclusively on the Angelic Airlines of the Grateful Dead because Beccause. And Trina carts this original around and it's like misspelled. Okay, so then, so now I learned from Trina so much. So now I learned from Trina how to edit a book. So then I edited my own book. I'm just going to run with this, right? Illuminations. And I asked every artist to do splash panels, because like I'm into splash panels, right? The big panel that's one statement rather than the boxes. And oh my God, Robert Williams, S. Clay Wilson are all in here. And even after getting Steve and Trina, everybody. I mean, thank you. So I think you have 2 pages, right? Yeah, so 2 pages from Trina. Then I pulled a switcheroo and I wrote a long story by myself with boxes and a whole story, and it runs through here where the splash panels interrupt it. But Dan Nadell in his book Art in Time, it's really neat. He took my story and ran it all together, and all very crisp, black and white. So you can look in Art in Time by Dan Nadell to see that whole story. Johnny, Julie, and Harpo. These are early comics from our day when we were doing San Francisco together. And this is a back cover Boogeyman that I got, with minus the front cover, but you said you like the crumbly stuff?
I do. I actually like comics that are beat up because they've been read so many times.
So, and Rory Hayes did this one, but here, is this the cover on the other side? Oh no, that's another thing. But anyway, here's these inside, here's a Spain thing. Here is my cover, Insect Fear #2. I did the back cover. This was taken from a Nabokov. Oh, the Boogeyman one is from Isaac Bashevis Singer's story, the story about the Dybbuks. You know, the Dybbuk, the dead fiddler, and the dead old lady have a big fight in the lady's stomach, the Dybbuk. It's from a Singer story. Okay, so so then you didn't hear from me. Oh, so my next thing was to make my own 36-page comic, but guess what? That's when the publishing stopped. That's where the Lulu comes in. And like, that's it. It wouldn't be published. My own Tales for the Modern Mystic. Hey, I'm a painter. I went into painting for 45, 50 years, right? And I ended up becoming religious at 45, making biblical murals. I sold one for $250,000 to Jerusalem, and I made a third. And Trina has a great picture of Trina in front of my mural in Jerusalem. But that gave me the freedom to make, it's a giant comic. I've created a giant comic. It's 16 feet by 6 feet, and it's every single verse. 859 verses in the book of Leviticus. And each one is a tiny picture, and it's numbered by chapter and verse, because it's not stories, it's laws. So how would you know where I was? So you can just go look chapter 19, verse 3, and check it out. But I've made and again, because Crumb, when they asked me, do you hear of Crumb's Genesis? I learned to just say, I have to go to the bathroom, because I can't get into, how annoyed I am. Because it's backwards wearing high heels, right? Yeah, well, I'm up to the 3rd book, every verse, and in Hebrew. So I'm just saying.
I want to ask you about something that I found online, actually. So, first of all, this is the cover, 2 different editions of the cover of the comic itself, and Willie was holding up one of them earlier. But in researching this, I found, can you see what that is?
What are you looking at?
Oh, wait.
Which?
I just wiped out the
Panther
screen.
Sister Beaten or Artist Plea?
Artist Plea.
Yeah.
Is this your ad for the first issue?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just wiped out the screen. There we go. So,
Yeah,
and
that
so
was in
did
the
this run in the
newspaper.
newspaper,
That was
right?
in the newspaper, yes.
And you're soliciting, I love that it's a hand-drawn ad, because everything was done by hand then, right?
Yes.
And did this run in only one issue of the newspaper, or multiple issues, or do you remember?
I really don't remember how many issues it ran in.
Was that the only way that you got submissions, or did you
Well, of course,
also
the first
invite
thing I
other
did was
people?
go to Willie,
Mhm.
you know, because she and I were the only two really women drawing underground comics in San Francisco. But then I asked other friends like Michelle Wrightson, who at the time was Michelle Brand. She did, I think, 3 or maybe 4 pages, charming stories, 2 lovely stories. She was very good, but she didn't have push, and that's why you've never heard of her, because she just didn't do a lot. And there was a socialist, Lisa Lyons, who was an incredibly good artist, had never done a comic before. And she said, you know, yeah, let me try that, and she did a beautiful comic. So we got some really good artists, and the middle story, which a lot of people like to write about, is the one in which the female comic characters rebel.
Oh, I have that in here, actually. And I want to ask you about that photo too, but is it this story, Breaking
That's
Out?
the one, Breaking
Yeah,
Out,
I love
yeah.
this.
People love it. People love it. I mean, nothing like that had been done before. But really, my cover echoes it. In my cover, you know,
Definitely.
I have the female comic characters breaking out.
Yeah, and I like how these are drawn more or less in the style of the, you know, of the main version that we know of those characters. Like Little Lulu is drawn like the Little Lulu strip, and this is the second tier is drawn like a romance strip. And then it's only 4 pages, and then they basically rebel. I like Extra Extra Supergirl breaks into women's prison and prisoners free. That's a presaging Bitch Planet, which is a really interesting series that Kelly Sue DeConnick writes. So this was published by, so you used the name from the newspaper.
Yes.
But it was published by Last Gasp, is
Yes. It was his second book. Ron Turner had already published 1 book.
Slow Death?
Slow Death, yes. And he wanted to do a woman's liberation book. And I had it all together at that point. I was going to go with another publisher, the Print Mint. I'd been talking with them about it, and they were very interested. Then I heard about Ron, and I simply phoned him. I said, I hear you want to do a women's liberation comic book. I have one all put together. And he came right over with a check for $1,000, which in those days was a fortune, you know, and just gave me the check and took the comic with him. And after that, the Print Mint asked me, the guys from the Print Mint, said, why didn't you give it to us? I said, well, Ron Turner came over with a check for $1,000. So that was nice, we were in demand.
And it went through, from what I can tell, it went through at least 3 printings, is that right?
Yeah, I think so, I think so. And the reason for the different colors, the way we did color in those days, the Neanderthal color separations, you know, it involved, with your X-Acto knife, cutting screens out on different, yeah, then go good, different sheets of acetate. So like you'd have like one for yellow, one for, oh my God.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I can hold it up while you talk if you want.
This is the black and white image, the regular image, and those are the acetates.
Oh, these are the black.
This is the black, because it was four of them, the black, and then a red, a cyan, and a
Red,
yellow.
blue, and yellow, basically.
And you had to make the other colors with Zipatone.
Yeah.
So this is actually how, like, this is before my time, but this is how they used to have to do color separations.
Yeah.
They would have to paint by hand and cut by hand, but in black and white, each color layer. So there's 4 colors in comic book printing: cyan or blue, magenta or red,
And
yellow,
black, of course.
and K is black, CMYK. And I can't, this is so hard for me to wrap my head around, that people can visualize what this is going to look like in yellow, and what this is going to look like in cyan, and how that's all going to marry together to create one color image.
Yeah.
And it's so cute, you learn in the art store, they have these little cross things that you put up to line them up with.
So anyway, the first one, the one with the kind of lavender background, that's the first one. And after I gave it to Ron, you know, for printing, it didn't occur to me that it might actually be reprinted. So I threw the color sets away.
Oh my God.
Oh, that's
And then Ron says, can I have those color sets? we're going to reprint. So I had to do them all over again, and I decided that I preferred green background to this lavender. So now everybody who collects these books can know that this is the first edition and this is the second edition.
Wow. That is a great story.
Look, the back cover is different too. It's your art, but it's done differently. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
you've
they
got
printed differently.
yeah, it's printed bigger here, and you've got all that blue here.
I love that story because I fully thought that was intentional and that you did them to distinguish between the different print runs.
No.
Do you want to talk about the photo on the Oma tie-in, or is that interrupting?
Oh, the photo of all of us? Yeah.
Oh yes, and I have a slide of that, so definitely let's talk about that. So this is you at around the time that you were making this comic?
Taken in my backyard.
When we shared a house, even, well, Trina was more pregnant than me, but we both were pregnant together.
I think Trina is no longer pregnant in this
No,
one.
in this picture.
No, so in the photo, Trina's baby Casey has been born.
So that's,
and I'm full term here, right?
So that's Willie on the upper left, standing, and you're obviously quite pregnant there, right?
So that's the whole thing. So that was, and it's in the book. So then when the book came out, I mean, it doesn't take much imagination to know that I had a baby.
So you were both dealing with newborns and or being
So
pregnant.
here's the thing, when I designed this story, I wrote the story and I knew I wanted like the movies, like monumental letters across the desert sky, like that kind of look, right, that they have in movie titles. I wanted 3 monumental letters, that's how many I had room for. And I came up, should I just talk regular? I came up with O-M-A, and then I put Oma. That's the title of the first story. So when I gave birth to a girl. So I named her Oma. And this is my fantasy about having a baby, though. Little girl of all the daughters, you were born a woman, not a slave. That's from Laura Nyro.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just wanted to throw in the Oma thing. Who turned into be a large miracle, which you'll read all about in Queen of Cosmos comics. So this Oma, you know what Oma means in Greek? It means tumor, sarcoma, cancer, carcinoma. Right? In my comic it says what? Because nobody learns Greek nowadays, right? So this kid gets cancer when she's 3, and she's given a 1-year prognosis. So in this book, Queen of Cosmos Comics, you'll read about what happened, but she lived 33 more years. So I personally fought with the angel of death all that time. And in the middle she changed her name to Annie. It's like everything's comics names, right? And she was a double Leo, powerful personality. And everyone called her Annie, the teacher, the everything. So she was Annie, and she declined for 33 years and died. It's all in the book. But that's the one I was in the belly in the picture.
And I also want to add that,
but you were talking. Trina's daughter Casey is a delight. I know her.
We were talking about having babies. When I was doing the color sets for this, I was nursing my new infant daughter at the same time.
When you'll see in my book that when I designed Where Smuggler Throws, this is really cute because here is the book. So you'll see this little panel of me in San Francisco with my baby that was born after yours at my breast, and I'm drawing Realm of Karma comics, which, between this and Trina Robbins revitalized my comic career in the past 4 years. It's amazing. But, because this was picked for the history of illustration. And that suddenly inspired me to make a brand new 36-page comic, at which time Trina had hired me to be a minion Yidden, to do her cover of her book, and I got to go to Comic-Con on a panel. And before that, the Women's Comic Anthology, thank you Trina, came out. And because of Trina, and I was invited to be on that panel, so I got to be at Comic-Con to hawk my new book. And believe me, we're not going to talk now how difficult that was another time.
I do have to tell everyone.
Thank you, Trina.
That when I decided I was going to do this, which is a comic adaptation of a book my father wrote in Yiddish in 1938, that you were my second choice because I really wanted Chagall. But he was not available, so I went to you.
Sadly not available.
Can you almost had a cheap date joke from me.
Can you tell us who else is in this photo with you?
Oh yeah, okay. So next to Willie is Michelle. She was Michelle Brand then. Later she became Michelle Wrightson. Next to her, that was Peggy. Now I have to tell you, we did not use our last names at the Women's Liberation newspaper because in those days, your last name was considered your slave name because it was the father's last name. So some of these women here, I can't give you their last names because I never knew it. That's Peggy. She was part of the A.B. Babe Basement Collective. And next to her, in that long dress and the long blonde hair, is Carol, whose last name I don't know. And she's the one who did most of the art on Breaking Out. That one that is now so iconic. Down below, next to me, I'm sitting there with baby Casey, who's not even probably 2 months old yet, is Lisa Lyons, who was the socialist cartoonist and had never done a comic before, but was such a good artist, and her comic was perfect, it was wonderful. And we're still Facebook friends, but I think she lives somewhere in the Pacific Northwest.
These are all in Berkeley?
Yes, yes.
Yes, this was all, everyone who contributed lived in the Bay Area at the time?
We all lived in the Bay
All of them, yeah, it was a real hotbed of interesting comics being published. And there's most of your names right there.
It's the staff in that list. I mean, thank God I read it. I was going to say, Trina, why didn't you put my name on the list? It's the staff.
No, it's the staff.
It's the staff, right?
Of the newspaper, yes.
And was this story written collectively? Because it
was
says...
written collectively, yes. But most of the art is done by Carol.
And then, Willie, I think you held up the cover to this earlier, All Girl Thrills. What can you tell us about this? This came shortly after.
Well, you know, when
A.B.
we did the comic in A.B. Babe, I talked with the collective about what can we call it? And I said, let's call it All Girl Thrills, because I have a sense of humor, you know. And these women were wonderful, but they didn't have the same sense of humor. And they said, oh no, you can't say girl. You know, you're just woman. And all woman thrills doesn't really work, does it?
No, it doesn't have quite the sense of irony.
Yeah. So we named it after the newspaper. And that seems to have worked.
And so why was there only one issue of It Ain't Me, Babe, and then you moved on to do another sort of one-shot
Women's comics. Well, yeah, and our one-shot, because we worked together very well. And we just, you know, women's comics started in 1972, so that gave us 2 more years to do comics. And this is what we did. We did Illuminations, we did All Girl Thrills. I did Girl Fight Comics, which isn't here because it was all me.
Well, I'm curious about, was there a particular reason that there was just that one issue that was called It Ain't Me, Babe? And, I mean, was there any discussion of continuing it and doing another issue under that title?
I think Ron did want to do more, but I had wanted it to be the best book ever created, you know, in answer to the guys. And it was good. It was very good, but it wasn't the best book ever created. So I decided I didn't want to do another. And I'm glad now, because after that came women's comics, and now It Ain't Me, Babe stands alone as the very first all-woman comic book in the world.
With this beautiful second one, All Girl Thrills.
Yes, and so how long after It Ain't Me, Babe did you do All Girl Thrills?
Next year.
It's 71.
Yeah, 71, 71.
And who were the other contributors to that?
Julie Good Vibes. She's very talented. She lived in Santa Cruz, which is, you know, the backyard of San Francisco, really. Just looking for one of her pages. She was just very, very talented.
Well, she and her guy, Robert, they wandered into Don Donohue's. There she is.
This is by Julie. She's just so very good. And I'm very sorry to tell you that her sister got in touch with me earlier in the last year, and she had died in 2004, which is very sad and much too early. But I have a couple of pages by her from All Girl Thrills that when I have my exhibits, I always show them.
Showing them in New York?
What?
We're showing them.
Yes.
And it looks like you did this one through the print mint, so you did not...
Yeah, well, that was
this?
to make up for the fact that I had given the other book to Ron, and they said, why didn't you give it to us?
This was their consolation prize?
Yeah.
And is this story that you showed in your panel the other day, where you're basically poking fun at the male underground cartoonist, was that in All Girl Thrills?
No, I don't even remember what book it was in, but it was in a benefit book, because the Zap comics had gotten busted for pornography. And so they did a benefit book in which you contributed comics, and the money that resulted went to help pay their lawyers and, you know, their fees, their court fees.
So this was part of the benefit book.
Yeah, and it was expressing how I felt, you know. If you go to the last, yeah, there it is, the last panel, after they've been jumping all over this woman, you know, invading her privacy and worse, a cop comes along and drags them off, and they shout help, and the woman, who of course is really me, is saying, why? You know, why the hell should I help you? Look how you're treating women.
So you did those two one-shots, 1970 and 1971, so you were on a roll, and then I think it was the year after that was 1972 was the first issue of Women's Comics, which ran for 20 years,
yes,
right?
until 1992.
Yeah, in between there, I moved to Oregon, so I moved away from the scene. But that's when I did Illuminations. I edited it, which I learned from Trina, from Oregon.
So
And
you
then
were-
Trina went into
You got
it, so we branched away at
infected
that
with the
time.
comic book bug.
But you
I'm
did
just saying,
stuff
we
for
branched away.
women.
A couple of things.
Yeah.
So
The first story, ironically, because they had the anthology of women's comics. It's huge. It's a double, gorgeous box, double set. And it won the Eisner for anthology.
yeah, it's beautiful.
nice.
If you're interested, the whole run of women's comics, and I think it also includes It Ain't Me Baby.
That's what I was going to say. So I
Yes.
think Trina was one of the editors, but even it starts with It Ain't Me Babe.
Yeah.
Before women's comics.
because
And
that's-
who has the first story in It Ain't Me Babe? So I had the first story in that giant anthology. It's funny.
So what was aside from, apparently the first issue was popular enough that you went through multiple printings, did you get any kind of direct reaction from people who were reading it? What kind of reactions? Were people sending you letters? Were they coming up to you in person at festivals? What was the reaction? Were people excited to see this new different perspective?
this was revolutionary. A comic all done by women. And women loved it. It was like, good heavens, look at this, women can do it too. So that when we came out with women's comics, and in women's it said, send us stuff, you know? And we were deluged by photocopies. We asked, please, no originals, you know. We're deluged by photocopies from women all over the country. And every I think it was like maybe every month, we would sit there, we would meet at someone's house, and just sit on the floor surrounded by all these entries and pick the ones we liked. And it was a collective. I've heard people say it wasn't, it was a collective, because we worked collectively. Yes, there was an editor, but it was a rotating editorship, so that each issue had a different editor. So nobody could play God, you know, nobody could be dictator. And we chose the work together.
That's a very different approach from most traditional publishing houses.
When the guys did comics, you know, they were God.
Here's the number 2 that I got.
Nice.
And here's, because I had a story in that one, number 2. Here's my story, Kiki the Groupie.
Yes.
And here's the same, so this is just saying about women's. This is translated into Danish. It's my story from women's, they must have done the whole women's comic, right?
Yes.
Well, I love that you both came into that you both converged in comics. It sounds like you really came at it at comics from different directions. Because Willie, you were coming from more of a fine art background, but you saw this as a very accessible medium. It sounds like that would enable you to reach more people more easily. Was that part of it?
For me, absolutely. That I could. 4-color was unthinkable when we were young. Unthinkable that you could make 4-color and you could give it to somebody. It was so
And
expensive.
look at the price, 50 cents.
That's it, but for 50 cents you can get this 4-color artwork. It was like a vehicle, like Daumier, like Toulouse-Lautrec.
Yes.
I brought originals, so don't forget this time.
Absolutely. Tell us about the originals that you brought.
Well, I just happened because my aunt hung on to these, and so I have the originals. My first story in It Ain't Me Babe, in this comic that we're on this panel for. This is just what they look like. Oma that I talked about, the 3 monumental letters. And well, you've probably seen the comic, but this is the original art. But you know what I happen to have stored with this? The original birth certificate for that Oma when she was born.
I never saw this.
And
The
Willie,
baby in the iconic belly.
Oh my God.
Willie, what did you draw with? Did you use pens or brushes? How did you
So
do
I go
that?
back and forth because influenced by mentors like Kim and Trina and a lot of people, and even some of the work in the New Comic is done with the brush. But like Sumi, I am a rapidograph. That's like an extension of me. So,
Yeah, your work is very intricate.
so I buy like 3 or 4 rapidograph widths and do mine.
Willie, she was born on my birthday.
I know, if you don't know this, thank you, Trina. This baby that we're talking about, Oma, with the 3 monumental letters that I named for the story in the book, was born on Trina's birthday. Could you believe it? I mean, it's really cosmic. It's very cosmic. I'm telling you, you have to add into it that Trina and I have became friends and have stayed friends. So that's the element, there's a genuineness. Because they asked me how I edited Illuminations. You call people up, you ask for a page, and you arrange to get it. It's not like it's not like a big friendship. It doesn't have to be to get a page from someone for a book. But in Trina's case, we have that wonderful, and I'm really into vibes, and I'm into the power of vibes. And I think that's what you see with me and Trina, that we have a vibe, and we're friends, and we love each other, and that's part of the story.
I also love that you're just like a living painting. Every time I see you, you look like one of your own paintings.
So I always do what I can to draw attention to my art. In LA, I painted my entire building. They named the square after me. Now, the first comic event I was invited to, thank you, Trina. So I hand painted a t-shirt. So this is something I can do to call attention to myself. So this is like my 6th one already. So what I'm wearing today, I hand painted in the last couple of weeks for today for
Would you give the audience the address of your store? Because you have to see this. You have to see this place. It's incredible.
My table is right outside the door here, so you can all pick up a free black and white flyer, but this is what the color looks like. But just check it out online and pick up a free black and white flyer across.
Tell them where they can find your store. Your
physical
gallery.
address.
Even that's a miracle. So it's Robertson. I tell you where it is, okay? It's on Barbara Mendes Square in Los Angeles, which is the corner of Robertson and Gibson. It's on the west side, near the freeway. And
I want to take a moment to connect the dots from women's comics through the current landscape of comics, and then open it up for questions.
and end up with that. We're going to be in a show that Kim Munson has curated in New York together. That Kim is hanging in now, and then we're both Trina and I and Kim will be in New York MoCA weekend, and Kim
when does
has
that
us on
open?
a panel.
It officially opens on the 11th. I'm going to hang the show tomorrow. But MoCA Fest is the first weekend in April, and we're all going to be on the panels, and the grand opening is then. And it's open until June 13th.
So where's the minion in Trina?
There it is. No, where is it?
So big shout out to Trina. Okay, so I don't know how I finagled this, Kim, but I brought it up with Kim discussing this art show in New York. This is an oil painting, right? This is a photo of an oil painting. It's the cover of this
And
book.
it's huge.
And the same thing with my Queen of Cosmos that I held up before. It's an oil painting. So 2 oil paintings. So I mentioned to Kim these oil paintings that are covers of books, and they're in the New York show.
We're showing those, and
The first 4 pages of the comic.
yeah, that's your version of the creation story, which is pretty amazing. The Society of Illustrators gallery is on 2 floors, and one floor has about 80 pieces from Trina's collection of historic women.
Early
cartoonists.
20th century.
Oh, I wish I could come to this.
And then downstairs, there's Willie's work plus 19 other artists that are doing contemporary graphic novels.
Go ahead.
I just want to add that I have the largest collection, probably in the world, of art by the early 20th century women cartoonists. And it was pretty easy to find the stuff because the guys were simply not interested in anything by women. So they're all paying a fortune for early Superman or Spider-Man art. And I got this stuff, and could afford it. And it was even given to me by some dealers because they're like, oh, it's by a woman, nobody's going to want it anyway, let's give it to Trina.
Well, that kind of brings us back full circle to the whole reason that you did It Ain't Me Babe in the first place, which was that the guys wouldn't let you play in their clubhouse, and you wanted to do comics. And by the time I started working in comics, I started reading comics when I was a little kid, probably you know, around 1970. So right when this stuff was just starting to come out. But in the 80s, the mainstream comic book shop landscape was totally superhero dominated, almost completely male dominated, until a bunch of independent publishers started cropping up, starting in the late 70s. The later issues of women's comics, like I remember this one, this cover from 1987, because I was so excited. I was like, women's comics, what? And I still have this in my basement. And it ran through 1992, and during those last couple of decades, during that last decade, there was the beginning of a huge sea change, I think, was happening. And there is, this is great, I forgot I threw this in here. This is an illustration from the very first issue of Women's
We all drew
Comics.
ourselves there. That was the first meeting. You know, we're meeting at Patty Moodian's house. And you know, Patty, we owe a debt to Patty Moodian, because I knew Ron wanted to do another women's comic, but I felt kind of burned out, you know, so I didn't do anything. But Patty worked for Last Gasp, and she got us together at her house, and this is, you know, the first meeting, as it were, of 10 women coming together to say, let's do a women's comic, and we didn't even have a name for it yet. We didn't know that we were saying its name. We came up with really bizarre names like Queen Kong and stuff. But all the while we were saying, what shall we call this women's comic? You know? And we realized we were saying its name.
Wow.
And I read in an interview with you that you got a little bit of grief from some corners about using this spelling. Is that true?
Oh, that was because, you know, the really, really strong feminist women's community, you weren't supposed to use the word men at all. And so they said, you didn't spell it right. You know,
So hardcore feminists would spell it like W-O-M-Y-N.
exactly. So for the last issue, we finally did call it, we removed the E and substituted an I, and it became Women's Comics.
And this year, I think, is part of the Women's Comics crew.
1976.
And very. And we've been talking a lot about Ron Turner, who ran Last Gasp Comics, and still does. He's still around. Right?
Yes, yeah, but he has retired. His son is doing the business.
But that guy is a big part of the reason that a lot of really cool comics came out in the 70s.
Also, the
and
reason
80s.
that a lot of cool comics didn't come out from another perspective, he's in my book and a whole other aspect, the aspect of great comics that didn't come out. But now they're coming out. But
So I love this because it's from the
He's
period, because by
noted.
the time I met him, it was the 90s, and he looked the same, but just gray.
Santa
gray
Claus.
beard, and yeah, gray hair. So I love
I
this
can
photo.
tell you from left to right, let's see, from our left to right, rather than the photo left to right, that's Becky Wilson, who was a designer par excellence and did an awful lot of the logos and also one comic. That's me peering out there. Shelby Sampson.
In front of Ron?
In front of Ron, that's Ron, of course, because he's the only guy there. Standing on top, Barbara Brown and Dot Booker. I think that's Dot Booker, yes. And then down below, Melinda Gebbie and Lee Morris.
Love that photo. This is, I just threw this in here because this is, it's very much in keeping with your It Ain't Me Babe cover, and when we were forming Friends of Lulu, this was one of Trina's concepts.
But they didn't go for it, they felt it was too revolutionary.
I totally love it. We also were a little bit
What
worried
a bunch
about
of wussies.
Well, we also were slightly worried about trademark infringement because we were incorporating as a nonprofit, so, but I totally love it, and I love it, and